Spanning the globe, it's World Affairs Roundup.
The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents World Affairs Roundup, a monthly edition of International Focus, providing opinion and analysis of global events, with John Katzka, a retired member of the U.S. Foreign Service, Ann Hamilton, political scientist at UW-Whitewater, who also served in the U.S. Foreign Service, and Robert Craig, executive director of Citizen Action of Wisconsin and author of articles and books on American foreign policy. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now, here's your moderator, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus and another edition of our World Affairs Roundup. Robert Craig is on special assignment, but our two remaining Roundup regulars are here to take a look at Mr. Kadyrov's Chechnya. With Chechnya as part of the backstory of the Boston Marathon bombings, we'll take a look at the erstwhile restive Russian Republic's recent history and current situation under its Kremlin-backed leader Ramzan Kadyrov. Syria's real friends, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, said this week that his group would not let the Assad government in Syria fall, adding the regime has, quote, real friends in the region. Syrian opposition leaders characterized Nasrallah's remarks as threats. How might Hezbollah factor into the Syrian equation? Un nuevo amigo en Mexico. President Obama traveled to Mexico's capital this week to meet with newly installed President Enrique Peña Nieto. How will a new Mexican administration impact relations with Washington, and how did the brewing U.S. domestic debate over immigration play into the visit? And Jailer's Dilemma. An expanding hunger strike by Guantanamo detainees and resulting forced feedings have thrust the controversial facility back into the headlines. What's keeping the president from making good on his early promise to shut it down? Well, welcome back, you two. John, let's start with Chechnya, if we could. Could you give us a little history of the place before we leap into the Boston Marathon bombings?
Okay, a little recent history first. I spent, during my two tours in Moscow in the 70s and the 90s, I spent a fair amount of time in the Caucasus. And the important point that the viewers should take away from those experiences is that it is very isolated, it is very mountainous, it is filled with peoples with very different cultures and religions and languages, all in a very relatively small space. The other thing is that there is a north-south divide in the Caucasus. I spent all my time in the southern Caucasus, which are probably more familiar to our viewers. That's Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. The northern Caucasus, which Chechnya is part of, and Dagestan, its next door neighbor, are the two most important. Going back through their recent history, we can go back to General Yermolov, who was a very famous Russian general, at least to the Russians. Most Americans don't know of him. But in 1812, when Andy Jackson was down in New Orleans, he was off there putting together a scorched earth policy in Chechnya because of, again, many revolutions and uprisings there. Tolstoy wrote a wonderful book in 1861 about the Cossacks and his own experience down there. And again, it's filled with all of the differences between the Russians and these ethnic peoples. 1944, Stalin took the entire Chechen nation and sent them off to Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. About half of the people apparently perished in the process. In 1956, they were allowed to return back to Chechnya after Stalin's death. That brings us up to 1999. Putin is about to go into the presidency of Russia, and one of the planks that he ran on was to solve the decade-old Russian war in Chechnya, and he was successful. That brings us up to relatively the present time and to Ramzan Kadyrov's reign as president of that particular republic.
So that's an interesting story in itself, the family's relationship with Moscow, isn't it, Anne?
Yes, it is. Ramzan Kadyrov is the son of a former president who was, both of them were part of the rebellion, insurgency against Russia. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Chechnya tried to declare its independence. It's one of the 21 republics within the Russian Federation. And as John mentioned, the 1999 war, there had been a previous war, 94 to 96, that had led to a stalemate, but a lot of destruction. And then in 1999, Putin, as John said, really obliterated the place and firmly won the war. But so there was a series of presidents, a number of who were assassinated. And in the process, the father, he became president and switched sides. And he was assassinated in 2004 at a commemoration of of a victory against the Nazis. And his son at that time was too young to become president. He was a very unimpressive guy who, had just been driving his father around basically and didn't have any experience. But over the next few years, he gained experience and became president in 2007. And since then has pretty much transformed the country. He has, with funds, completely funded by Moscow. He has completely rebuilt the city, building the largest mosque in, I don't know, Europe or the world. So it's a very impressive building, so that it all looks brand new. But he has committed tremendous number of human rights abuses, and he lives a rather lavish, bizarre lifestyle.
So if we jump forward then to the bombings in Boston, neither one of the alleged perpetrators actually ever lived in Chechnya, right? So this is one of those conflicts that just has a life of its own and is...
Well, the way I think you need to look at the relationship between the Tsarnaev brothers and Chechnya itself is that they just happen to be Chechen. More important is to look at their Islamic connections, which developed rather slowly into what's now a Sufi-based but pan-Islamic movement within the Caucasus that spreads well beyond the Caucasus. It's all through all of Islam, and the brothers were much more tied into that than any kind of protests. The protest regarding Chechnya in the United States made no sense whatsoever.
Well, and what about the conflict in general? I mean, most Chechens are Muslim, but it's essentially, at the local level at least, much more of a nationalist struggle, isn't it? I mean, it really doesn't have much of a religious component to it.
Well, yes and no. I mean, in the sense that the current leader, Kadyrov, is increasingly making the country more and more Islamist. He's kind of walking a fine line between being totally supported by the Russians and being committed to supporting the Russians in all ways, but he's also turning the country increasingly Islamist by dress codes and a number of things. And so you have a population that's rather split. That itself is becoming increasingly Islamist, not radical Islamist, but increasingly Islamist, and perhaps in the future more anti-Russian than it appears to be right now.
Well, and there's a backdrop to this as well. We're talking about a very depressed economy. Yeah. And as we have seen in any number of other occasions, the youth in that process is even higher in terms of the unemployment rates. So you have people with a lot of time in their hands and nothing to do and no money to spend. So that's fertile ground for wild ideas to take root. But this fits into another issue that's coming up. 2014, Sochi is going to be the host of the Winter Olympic Games. Sochi is on the coast of the Black Sea, on the far western part of the Black Sea. And Chechnya is on the Caspian Sea, but they're on a parallel. The distances are not particularly great. The danger to the Olympics is not from Chechnya, but from certain Chechens, as well as Dagestanis and others who might use this as an opportunity to get back at the Russians.
We'll assume there'll be muscular security in place for that one. Well, let's move now to Syria and Hezbollah's involvement there. We've said in the opening, the leader made some remarks about Hezbollah not being willing to let the Assad government fall. And now there's talks of counterattacks by the Syrian opposition against Hezbollah. What is Hezbollah actually up to on the ground besides speechifying?
Well, apparently it does have troops on the ground, and just recently, I think 18 were killed. And it's in terms of turning the conflict has been seen as international because of the fact that there have been jihadists on the rebel side. But now it appears, I don't know whether there are other foreign fighters on the government side. I don't know if people have been talking about Iranian troops on the ground. I haven't heard of that. But now it appears that these are Hezbollah fighters from Lebanon, supported by the party who's in power in Lebanon. So it does make it even more interesting. And they're there saying that they're supporting Assad because the rebels are turning everybody's attention away from the most important cause, which is to fight Israel.
Right.
So.
Well, to the extent that there is such a thing, the mythical Arab street seemed to be largely on the side of the people fighting the Assad regime. But
that's because we have this Sunni-Shia split here, and some of our friends are Sunnis, like Saudi Arabia, and that helps to form our opinion of what's going on.
But I mean, does that further isolate Hezbollah from the mass of the Arab population? I mean, they gained a great deal of credibility and popularity, really, in their recent battles with the Israelis. I mean, I guess one question might be, what is in it for them? Is it strictly a Shia thing? I mean, the Alawite regime of Hafez al-Assad and his son is loosely an offshoot of Shia Islam as well. Does it really come down to that for Hezbollah, do you think?
I think it does. If you look at the Alawites are a offshoot, as you pointed out, but they have been in recent years very much in Iran's camp, as is Hezbollah. And so what you have to look at Syria is through the eyes of what the Iranians are doing in this process. And the fact that one of their generals, Shateri, was shot on his way to Aleppo, obviously, as they said, for construction work there.
Right. Well, we've got just about a minute before our break, but one thing we should touch on is reports of the use of chemical weapons by the regime. Now,
and red lines.
And is this in fact the inverse of what we saw in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, where the administration really doesn't want to see irrefutable evidence because they've said, if in fact they use, that is a red line, and they'd really not have to cross that red line.
Right, and it's quite interesting because now there are reports that the U.S. government is wanting to send in UN government inspectors to make sure, UN inspectors, weapons inspectors, to make sure that there actually were chemical weapons used. So it's a great irony.
Yes, I suspect we know whether or not they were used. The question becomes is how much of a factor it was in the decision. I mean, if you drop 1 ounce of this stuff, is that the red line, or does it mean that you have to wipe out 50,000 people? Is that the red line? I don't know the answer to that.
Well, stay tuned on that one. We'll be back with more, but right now we'll take a short break.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. We're now moving south of the border to Mexico. And Ann, the president met with the newly installed president of Mexico in Mexico City this week. So what was on the agenda there?
Well, there were a lot of things on the agenda, including trade, immigration, the drug war, of course. And I think that the point that I think comes out of what I've heard about the talks is that both sides have been very good at respecting each other's sovereignty in terms of immigration, in terms of the drug war. There's been a lot of press on the fact that the Peña Nieto has decided to centralize the relationships with the U.S. where the drug war is concerned, and instead of having contacts, say, directly between intelligence agencies and police forces, which was allowed under the previous administration, all contacts are going to be processed through the Interior Ministry.
Well, and they had things like drone flights into the interior and so on.
Right. It was very strong cooperation, and some might even call it, a loss of sovereignty on Mexico's part. I think that Peña Nieto here is needing to establish his position at home. He didn't win the election by a great margin. I mean, more than people thought he would, and he doesn't have a majority in the parliament. He has a plurality, and he has this very, very ambitious reform agenda. So I think that we don't actually know how this whole process of contacts between the U.S. and Mexico is going to work itself out in the end. But I think that a lot of this is to try and consolidate his position at home by making sure that he shows that Mexico is a sovereign country and doesn't have to be pushed around by the U.S.
The way I looked at it was that the president's overall purpose in this particular trip is trade and regional security. Mm-hmm. I mean, he's right now he's off at a conference among Central African governments, and the big thing is that we always are looking at Mexico in terms of the drugs, the guns, and what the president was pointing out was that Mexico, the U.S. is Mexico's principal foreign trade partner, and Mexico is third or fourth in terms of importance to the United States. I mean, that's a major kind of relationship, and the reforms that you were discussing become very important in terms of improving that. Mm-hmm. Oil, for example, if they were to put together some of the reforms that might encourage U.S. oil investment, could help drive the Mexican economy even further. And that works out for us because if Mexico is more successful, then the pressure for people to come across the border into the United States is less.
Well, and that brings up the other topic that was sort of danced around on both sides, and that's immigration. What has been sort of the Mexican best-case scenario for the U.S. immigration policy?
Well, I think that they would like to see the current bill go through. But the Peña Nieto is talking about how he needs to improve the economy at home, just as John said, so that not as many people want to immigrate. He talks a lot about respect for the rights of Mexicans who are here. But one of the important things to point out is that in 2012, they were at a zero migration rate, I guess. As many people left to go back to Mexico as came here, so that the numbers of people who are increasing.
2013 is now, there's another influx that's coming in.
Okay. So, well, we'll have to see. We'll have to see what happens with that. I think, though, that he was very careful in terms of saying, that's your issue. You know, we want to help you out with it, but we're not going to. He realizes that if he is very critical, it's not going to help the bill pass anyway.
So one of the interesting aspects in terms of Mexican politics was the return of the PRI. And the party that the current president belongs to was in power for essentially the entire 20th century. Right. So what do we make of the fact that they're now back?
Well, he's saying a lot that it's different, that this is a new party, that they're doing different things, and don't look to our history, look to what we're doing now.
I think we have to see to what extent he can be independent of the very, very strong powers that be within the PRI. And that we'll see as, as he tries to put his reforms in, and the extent to which he can get the support of the other dominant party that he needs, which is it's no longer dominant in terms of votes, but he needs the PAN, which was in power before.
So, and his party on the political spectrum, sort of right to left, would fall where these days, would you say?
In the middle. I mean, it's a very much of a centrist umbrella party that tries to incorporate all points of view, but it's always been very dependent on the patron-client relationships and corporatist interest structure.
So the takeaway then is, other than trying to assert his strength as a leader and heading Mexico that can say no to the Colossus of the North from time to time when it needs to, would you see any change in the policies, north-south?
I see the visit by our president as a way of not propping up, but bolstering the image of the Mexican president.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's move on to another story involving image. In this case, the image of the U.S. There's a growing hunger strike on the part of Guantanamo detainees, and decision has been taken to force feed them if they won't eat on their own, and that's brought the facility into some unwelcome headlines and headlights again. There's been letters from the American Medical Association, from the UN, from the Red Cross objecting to what's going on there. And on his second day of his first term, the president said he would close it. And so here we are, these many years later, and it's still open, and it's still bringing bad press. So why isn't it closed?
Because of bureaucratic infighting between the Congress and the president, because there is a concern on both parts not to look like they're giving in to terrorism in general. There's also some precedents that complicate this thing. There's the 2009, when President Obama wanted to take all the detainees and move them to a prison in Illinois. There was a vote in the Senate which was 90-6 against that idea. So those are kind of precedents that have impact on this. We have the Yemenis issue, where a Yemen terrorist was involved in an attempt to was it skyjack or
hijack the plane to Detroit, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So this is significant because there are now 166 detainees left, 86 of which the various intelligence agencies have said could be released. And among that 86, 56 are from Yemen. So a good chunk of them could be accounted for in one go.
Right, and Congress has said we can't send them back to Yemen unless we make guarantees that these people will never be a security threat again, which would be very difficult to do.
Well, and Yemen is a mess right now as well.
So what are the levers through which Congress can stop that? I mean, couldn't the president just sign an executive order and say, open the gates and send them out?
Something called funding.
Yes.
How so?
Well, they have to, in order to be able to, the idea that they were going to be moved to Illinois, one of the reasons that it was voted against, so they didn't want to spend any money, U.S. taxpayer money, to move those people from one place to another.
Right, but I think we're in a different era now, because the fact that this is in the front pages, and the incredible the stories coming out of the tubes being forced down the noses of these people and down their throats, and while they're in shackles, and that they're being denied the right to actually refuse food. It takes it to a whole new level, and it's going to be very difficult to just let it go. I have a student who's writing a paper on this, and initially we were talking about it before all this happened, and I was saying, well, I guess one alternative is that eventually it will have to close, because eventually You know, it sounds terrible, but eventually everybody there will die. You know, it's just a very long, terrible scenario, but I don't think that's going to be viable anymore. They're going to have to figure out something to do.
The British have some wonderful experiences in the Irish, on the Irish question, of the power of hunger strikes as a way in which to embarrass and change policy.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously it's a PR disaster no matter which way you go. You're faced with the choice of either letting someone die and you have like increasing numbers of fatalities, or shackling people and putting tubes down their nose.
And
so,
having the American Medical Association saying that it's in complete abuse, because there are doctors supervising this, so it's not as if they have to come out and have some statement.
Well, we've got about 30 seconds left. Final question then, will Git Mo be closed in Obama's term?
Oh. I think it will.
I don't know. I don't know. It's reaching the point where it doesn't serve the purpose that it did at the beginning of, right after 9/11.
Well, yet another one to stay tuned on. To our viewers, we'll see you next time with more International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website.